It was just another ordinary day in a courtroom, or so everyone thought. The air was thick with the usual buzz of whispers, the shuffle of papers, and the rhythmic tapping of pens. But in the midst of all this, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A young black woman, dressed in a sharp suit, walked into the room with an air of quiet confidence. Her every step was deliberate, yet the tension in the room felt almost palpable. The officers sitting at the front of the court glanced at each other with smirks as she passed by. They didn't know who she was, but it didn't matter. They thought they had her pegged. What they didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary woman was about to shatter their assumptions. The cops, perhaps used to judging people based on appearances, couldn't resist mocking her under their breath. They whispered amongst themselves, laughing at her attire, her demeanor, her very presence. They thought she was just another person caught up in the system, someone who didn't belong in their world. Little did they know, she wasn't there to be judged. She was there to do the judging. As the proceedings began, the woman remained calm, keeping her focus on the task at hand. But when the time came for her to make her move, she did something no one expected. She reached into her bag, pulled out her FBI badge, and held it up for everyone to see. The room went silent. The smug officers who had mocked her earlier suddenly froze, their faces draining of color. Their confidence turned to fear as the realization hit them like a ton of bricks. The woman they had been mocking wasn't just anyone. She was one of the most powerful people in the room, a member of the very agency they had long respected and feared. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The officers who had once found amusement in her presence now stood to attention, their posture rigid as they processed the shocking revelation. The woman's calmness was now more than just impressive, it was downright intimidating. What had started as a moment of mockery had turned into a moment of awe and respect, leaving everyone in the room scrambling to understand how they had misjudged her. But just as things began to settle, a second story started to unfold, one that would prove just as jaw-dropping. A black teenager, sitting on a crowded bus, noticed something that would change his life forever. He had seen the woman standing, clearly struggling to maintain her balance as the bus jerked through the city streets. Without hesitation, he stood up and offered her a seat. At first, she hesitated, surprised by the young man's gesture. In that moment, a bond formed between them, one that transcended race, age, and circumstance. The woman, grateful for the kindness, took the seat. What happened next, though, would leave the young man speechless. The woman, with a quiet smile, pulled a small piece of paper from her bag and handed it to him. "This note is for you," she said, her voice soft but firm. He didn't know it at the time, but that note would change his life forever. And that's where the story gets even more interesting. What was in that note? What had the woman seen in the young man that led her to give him such a life-altering gift? The note, simple as it may seem, would open doors for the teenager that he never thought possible. The quiet act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of his future. But we're left wondering, what was it that changed the young man's life? How did this seemingly small gesture have such a massive impact on his future? And how would the courtroom drama unfold after the woman's shocking revelation? The stage was set, but the biggest surprises were still yet to come. Stay tuned, because the truth behind both of these powerful moments is about to unfold. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs after the woman revealed her FBI badge, and the officers who had once mocked her now struggled to regain their composure. The tension was thick in the air, so much so that even the judge seemed to sense something wasn't right. She took her seat, still calm, still composed, her eyes scanning the room. It was clear that whatever had brought her here was no accident, and this was no ordinary day in court. But the officers, they hadn't just mocked her. They'd underestimated her in a way that could cost them dearly. As the court session proceeded, the woman sat quietly, her mind working behind her unreadable gaze. She wasn't there for revenge or drama. No, her mind was focused on something far more important. The case at hand was critical, but it wasn't just any case. It was a high-profile case, one involving corruption within law enforcement, a case that had been quietly brewing in the shadows for months. The officers who had mocked her? They were deeply entangled in this mess. And that's why she was there. She wasn't a participant. She was the one holding the key to unraveling the whole thing. Her phone vibrated silently in her bag, a message flashing across the screen. She glanced at it briefly, just enough to catch the words, "They're coming for you." The message was cryptic, but she didn't need to ask who they were. She had been in this line of work long enough to know that when someone sent a warning like that, it was serious. The thought that someone might be out to silence her didn't faze her, though. She had seen it all before. No, it was just another part of the job, another challenge to face head-on. But the tension in the room wasn't just about her case. There was a story unfolding outside the courtroom, one that had yet to reveal itself. The black teenager on the bus had no idea that the woman he had so casually helped would turn out to be someone who could change the course of his life. He had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, where people like him were often overlooked and forgotten. He'd been taught to survive, not to dream. But when he saw the woman struggling to keep her balance, something inside him pushed him to act. As the bus rumbled through the city streets, he had glanced around, noticing that no one else had offered to help her. The other passengers were too caught up in their own lives, too focused on their phones, their conversations, their own little worlds. But not him. He had been raised with values of respect and kindness, taught by his grandmother who often said, "The way you treat others will always come back to you." When the woman accepted his offer, he hadn't expected much. He didn't even think about the fact that she was white or that she was older. It was just a simple act of kindness, something that felt right. And when she handed him the note, his curiosity flared. What could a woman like her, someone who seemed so poised and important, want to give him? He had opened it in a rush, eager to see what it said. The note wasn't long, just a few sentences, but it left him in a daze. He couldn't believe what he was reading. "Your future is brighter than you think. Keep going. I'll be watching." At first, the words didn't make sense. Who is this woman, and why was she so invested in his future? What did she see in him that he hadn't yet seen in himself? He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket. It felt like a secret, like a promise, but a promise of what? He didn't know, but deep down, he knew this wasn't just some random act of kindness. It was a signal, something more. The next few days passed in a blur. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something had shifted in his life. He kept replaying the moment over and over in his head, but the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. Who was this woman, really? Why had she chosen him out of everyone else on that bus? And why had she taken the time to write him a note at all? Meanwhile, the woman in the courtroom had a mission of her own. She had known this day was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Corruption within law enforcement wasn't new, but this case was different. This wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was about a system that had been compromised at the highest levels. The officers she was facing in court were no strangers to manipulation and deceit. They had spent years covering their tracks, making sure no one ever uncovered the truth. But she had spent just as many years tracking their every move, patiently waiting for the right moment to bring them down. The problem was, she wasn't the only one who knew about their secrets. There were others, dangerous people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. And if the woman wasn't careful, they might try to silence her before she could do any more damage. She couldn't afford to let that happen. Not now. Not when she was so close to bringing everything into the light. As the court session dragged on, the woman found herself glancing at the officers who had mocked her earlier. They were no longer smirking. They were on edge, their faces betraying a hint of fear that they had been trying to hide. She knew they were calculating their next move. They had to be wondering how she had found out so much, how she had come to be in the position she was. But they had no idea that the real game was just beginning. Outside the courtroom, the black teenager was beginning to see the effects of the note. It wasn't anything huge at first, just small changes in his life. His grades were improving. He felt more confident at school. And people seemed to be noticing him in a way they hadn't before. It was as though a door had opened in his life, and he had no idea how to step through it. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that the woman's words had ignited something inside him. But as the days went on, he started to realize something. The more he changed, the more people around him seemed to take notice. Some of his friends had started acting strange, almost distant. And then there were the whispers. There were rumors that he was involved with someone important, that he was connected to something bigger than he could imagine. But what was that something? And who was this woman who had given him the note? The mystery deepened, and with every passing day, the tension mounted. Both the woman in the courtroom and the teenager on the bus were unknowingly walking parallel paths, two people whose lives were about to collide in ways neither of them could predict. The clock was ticking, and every move they made was one step closer to a truth that would change everything. But what that truth was, and how it would all unfold, remained a mystery. Days passed, and the web of tension continued to weave its complex threads. The woman, now fully aware of the magnitude of what she was up against, kept her emotions in check, her demeanor stone cold. But beneath her composed exterior, the weight of her task was pressing down on her. The FBI was no stranger to high-profile cases, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about catching a few bad cops. It was about unraveling an entire criminal network that stretched further than anyone could have imagined. She had pieces of the puzzle, but they were scattered, fragmented, and time was quickly running out. Each day in court brought a new layer to the mystery. The officers, once so confident, now struggled to maintain their composure. Their nervousness was palpable, even to the casual observer. One of them, Officer Ramirez, couldn't hide his fidgeting as he adjusted his tie for the 5th time in 10 minutes. Another, Officer Daniels, kept glancing nervously at the clock, his eyes darting to the door every time it creaked open. It was clear that the tension was getting to them. But what had they done to warrant such fear? The woman knew, and she was getting closer to uncovering the full extent of their involvement. Outside the courtroom, the young teenager, whose life had been changed by the woman's note, had no idea just how deeply entangled his fate had become in this unfolding drama. At school, the whispers about him had grown louder. His classmates, once indifferent to his existence, now looked at him with curiosity, as if trying to figure out the secret he was keeping. He'd noticed the way people stared at him, the subtle shift in their treatment of him. But it wasn't just his peers. A few adults had begun showing interest in him too, and that was what made him uneasy. He was used to being invisible, not the center of attention. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, a sleek black car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in a suit. The stranger didn't introduce himself, but his voice was smooth, almost soothing. "I hear you've been receiving some attention lately," the man said. The teen froze, his heart pounding. The man didn't sound threatening, but the coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. "You've been noticed. Someone has their eye on you," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "If you want to protect yourself and your family, you'll need to take the next step." The teenager didn't know what to make of the encounter. Was this some kind of joke? Who was this man? But one thing was clear, his life was no longer his own. He had been swept up into something far larger than he could comprehend. And with that encounter, the piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. The woman's note, her cryptic words about his future, weren't just a kind gesture. She had been signaling him, giving him a way out, a chance to rise above the life that had always seemed so impossible. But at what cost? What had she gotten him into? Back in the courtroom, the woman's nerves were on edge, though she showed no outward signs of it. Her role in this case had to remain under wraps for now. She was a ghost, operating from the shadows, moving through the legal system while simultaneously maneuvering within the FBI's labyrinthine corridors. But the deeper she dug into the case, the more she realized that the corruption within the police force was only the tip of the iceberg. There were powerful figures pulling the strings, and these figures had far-reaching influence. One of the most unsettling things she had discovered was that several of the police officers involved had connections to organized crime. Their network spanned across the city, operating like a well-oiled machine. These officers didn't just take bribes, they were part of a larger criminal syndicate, one that controlled everything from local drug trafficking to illegal gambling rings. The woman knew that if she wasn't careful, she would soon become a target. She had to stay 2 steps ahead, or risk losing everything she had worked for. The woman's investigation had also begun to unravel a deeper mystery. The woman on the bus, the one who had offered the teenager a life-changing note, had a far more significant role in this situation than anyone realized. She wasn't just a random passenger. She was connected to the network in ways that would shock everyone, maybe even the young man who had unknowingly crossed paths with her. Her actions weren't just coincidental. She had been watching the teenager long before their brief encounter on the bus. Her kindness wasn't accidental. It was intentional, calculated. She had been tracking him for weeks, maybe longer, waiting for the right moment to make contact. The more the woman uncovered, the more she began to suspect that the teenager had been chosen for something much larger. His life had been on a set path, one that had been manipulated by powerful forces. The woman knew she had to protect him. He was caught in the middle of a dangerous game, one he didn't even realize he was playing. The conflict was escalating on all fronts. The cops in the courtroom were rattled, their fear growing with every passing minute. They knew the woman was onto them, and they knew the walls were closing in. But they weren't about to go down without a fight. Officer Ramirez had already begun making plans, speaking in hushed tones with his colleagues. They would have to deal with the woman before she could destroy everything they had worked for. And they had no intention of letting a single piece of their operation fall apart, not when it had taken them years to build it. The teenager, meanwhile, was being pulled in multiple directions. He hadn't signed up for any of this. His life had been about survival, not grand schemes or high-stakes games. But with every new encounter, with every strange message and cryptic warning, he was beginning to see that survival wasn't going to be enough anymore. His future, the one the woman had alluded to in her note, was slipping out of his control. He couldn't turn back now. There was no way out of this but forward. The woman, too, was caught in a storm of her own making. Every step she took brought her closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her mission had started out simple, expose the corruption in law enforcement. But now, with the teenager's involvement and the growing threats to her own life, the stakes had become much higher. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and every time she thought she had found the edge, another complication emerged. Her investigation was no longer just about right and wrong. It was personal, and that made it all the more dangerous. The forces she was up against had deep roots, and if she wasn't careful, they could pull her under before she even had a chance to finish what she started. Every second was a risk, and she was running out of time. The tension in the courtroom was building to a breaking point. Each moment felt heavier than the last, each whisper more urgent. The officers were no longer playing the role of innocent bystanders. They were the ones under suspicion now. They were the ones who would have to answer for their actions. But the real question was, how far were they willing to go to protect themselves? Would they risk everything to keep their secrets hidden, even if it meant taking someone down along the way? As the stories of the woman, the teenager, and the officers continued to intersect, the conflict deepened. Each of them had their own goals, their own motivations, but none of them realized just how connected they had become. They were all racing toward the same truth, whether they liked it or not. And the consequences of that truth would be more explosive than anyone could imagine. The tension in the courtroom had reached a boiling point. The woman, her hands now clenched at her sides, could feel the weight of the room's eyes upon her. Every second felt like an eternity, every movement amplified. She was so close, so dangerously close, to unraveling the entire operation. But there were too many forces working against her now. The officers, who had once been so confident, now exchanged furtive glances, their nervous energy betraying their carefully constructed facade. Officer Ramirez, the one who had mocked her earlier, was now sweating, his shirt sticking uncomfortably to his back. He had stopped pretending to be interested in the proceedings, his gaze flicking back and forth to the door, the clock, and then to her, his obvious unease nearly impossible to ignore. Something had shifted in the air. Everyone could sense it. Behind the scenes, the woman's phone buzzed again. Another message. They know. They're coming for you. Her heart skipped a beat, but her expression remained unchanged. She was used to threats, but this felt different. The walls were closing in, and there was no room left to hide. She couldn't afford to be distracted, not now. Her mission had to come first, even if her own safety was slipping away with each passing minute. Outside the courtroom, the teenager's life was spiraling faster than he could keep up with. The encounter with the mysterious man in the black car had set off a chain of events he couldn't control. The man's words echoed in his mind, haunting him. "You've been noticed. Someone has their eye on you." At first, he had shrugged it off, thinking it was just some random stranger. But that night, as he lay awake in his bed, unable to shake the sense of impending danger, he began to wonder if he had been drawn into something far larger than he could comprehend. The next day, as he walked to school, he saw them. Two men in dark suits, standing at the corner near his apartment building, their eyes fixed on him with unnerving intensity. He quickened his pace, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He knew they were watching him, tracking his every move. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Every step felt like he was being pulled deeper into a web he didn't understand. Back in the courtroom, the woman's instincts were screaming at her. She could feel it, the moment when everything would shift. The officers were growing restless, whispering among themselves, glancing around nervously. They knew something was about to happen. But what could they do? They were cornered. Every lie, every cover-up, was slowly being exposed. It was only a matter of time before the full extent of their involvement came to light. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed through the courtroom as the door to the hallway was slammed open. The room went silent, every head turning toward the source of the noise. Two men, dressed in black suits, stepped into the room. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold and calculating. The tension was electric as the officers in the room stiffened, their gazes darting between the newcomers and the woman sitting at the front. There was no question now. These men weren't just ordinary attendees. They were here for something much bigger. The woman's pulse quickened. She knew who they were. They were sent by the higher-ups, the ones who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. The ones who didn't want the truth to come out. The ones who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to silence her. And now, it seemed, that moment had come. But there was something else, something she hadn't anticipated. As the men approached, their eyes fell on the officers in the room, particularly on Officer Ramirez. The tension that had been building for so long was about to explode, and in that instant, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The woman knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The officers, the men in black suits, the teenager, everything had been leading to this moment. Outside the courtroom, the teenager had found himself in even deeper trouble. As he made his way to his usual spot after school, he noticed someone standing by the bus stop, waiting. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart racing as he recognized the figure. It was the woman from the bus, the one who had given him the life-changing note. But now, she looked different. Her eyes were cold, distant, as if she had become someone else entirely. "Come with me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You don't have much time." Confusion swept over him. This wasn't the kind woman he had helped that day. Something had changed. Something dangerous had shifted in the air. Without thinking, he followed her, his feet moving almost against his will. But as they turned a corner, he felt it. Someone was watching them. Someone was close. "Where are we going?" he asked, trying to steady his breath. "To a place where you can be safe," she replied, but there was no comfort in her words. It was clear that she wasn't entirely sure how they were going to get out of this alive. The forces closing in on them were too powerful. The game had changed, and the stakes had risen to a level neither of them could have predicted. Back in the courtroom, things were reaching a breaking point. Officer Ramirez, now visibly sweating, stood frozen in his place as the two men approached him. His hands trembled as they held out a folder, thick with documents. The woman watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. She knew that this moment would define everything, the moment when the officers either crumbled under the pressure or doubled down on their lies. There was no way to turn back now. The two men stood face to face with Ramirez, their expressions unreadable. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The officer's voice broke the silence as he stammered, "I don't know anything about this. You've got it all wrong." But the men didn't respond. They simply watched him, their eyes piercing through him like knives. And as the tension hung in the air, the woman knew the moment had come. She had waited for this for months, and now, everything was about to be revealed. But just as the weight of the revelation seemed poised to drop, another shockwave rocked the room. The door slammed open once again, and this time, it wasn't just two men in black suits. It was an entire team, armed and ready for whatever came next. The game was changing, fast, and no one knew who would come out on top. The hour of reckoning had arrived, and the question now wasn't just how the story would end, but who would survive it. The courtroom was now a pressure cooker, the air thick with uncertainty. The armed team had poured in through the door, their presence instantly shifting the dynamics of the room. The woman's heart raced in her chest as she watched the officers squirm under the weight of the situation. The tension that had been slowly building for months was now at its peak, and every second felt like it might explode. But then, something completely unexpected happened. The leader of the armed team, a tall man with sharp features and an unreadable gaze, walked straight up to the woman. For a brief, fleeting moment, their eyes met, and there was something in his look, a recognition, a shared understanding, that sent a chill down her spine. She had seen that look before. It wasn't the kind of look one gets from a stranger. No, this was someone who knew her, someone who had been watching her just as closely as she had been watching them. The tension in the room was thick as the man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it directly to her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but unmistakable. For a moment, she hesitated. This wasn't the part of the plan she had prepared for. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Had they known? Had they been one step ahead all along? As she took the envelope, the officers behind her exchanged panicked glances. Ramirez, who had been standing frozen, now looked like a man on the verge of a breakdown. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman's eyes remained locked on the envelope in her hand. She had to make a decision, and fast. Without a second thought, she ripped open the seal and unfolded the contents, her fingers trembling. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper with a name, an address, and a cryptic phrase that seemed to echo in her mind. "The truth lies beneath the surface." The weight of those words hit her like a ton of bricks. Beneath the surface? What did that mean? And why had they given this to her? Was it another layer to the conspiracy? Or had they just handed her the final clue to uncovering everything? The room seemed to hold its breath as the woman looked up at the leader of the armed team. Before she could speak, a sharp, hurried voice cut through the tension. "What's going on? Why are you giving her that?" It was Officer Daniels, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. He took a step forward, but the armed men didn't flinch. They stood, stoic, as if they were untouchable. The leader of the team turned toward Daniels, his expression unchanging. "It's not for you to understand," he said flatly. "You've lost your place in this." The words hit like a blow. The officers, who had been so confident just moments ago, now looked like children in the face of a force they couldn't comprehend. The woman felt the weight of the moment. Something was coming, something big. And it wasn't just about her anymore. The officers' fear wasn't just about the consequences they would face in court. It was about something far deeper, something that had been hidden from everyone for years. Before anyone could react, the man in charge of the armed team turned and began walking toward the exit. He looked over his shoulder just once, locking eyes with the woman again. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," he said, his words like a warning. "But you will." With that, the armed men exited the room, leaving behind an atmosphere of stunned silence. The officers, still paralyzed by shock, were now entirely at a loss. Their once tightly knit facade was crumbling. The woman could see it on their faces, the terror of knowing that they weren't in control anymore. Outside the courtroom, the teenager had been following the woman's movements since their brief meeting at the bus stop. Something about her had seemed different that day, strange even. And now, as he watched her leave the building, The feeling of danger was stronger than ever. He followed her from a distance, careful not to let her see him, but his curiosity was too great to ignore. Just when he thought he had lost her in the crowd, he saw her again, walking briskly through the parking garage. She was talking to someone on the phone, her voice calm but urgent. He couldn't hear the words, but the tone told him everything. She was being careful, guarded. There was something big going on, something that was way beyond what he could have ever imagined. Suddenly, she stopped, her posture tensing. He ducked behind a pillar, trying to remain out of sight. And that's when he saw them. The men in black suits again. But this time, they weren't walking away. They were following her, their movements deliberate. They knew who she was. They knew what she was about to uncover. And from the way they were closing in on her, it was clear that they weren't just shadowing her. They were hunting her. Panic began to creep into his chest. He knew something was terribly wrong, but what could he do? He had no idea what was really going on, no idea who was behind all of this. And the woman, she had been his lifeline, the one person who had seen something in him. But now, he wasn't sure if she could save herself, let alone him. Meanwhile, the woman had reached her car, still clutching the envelope. Her thoughts were racing. Beneath the surface? What could that possibly mean? She had uncovered so many layers of corruption. But this felt different. The people she was dealing with weren't just criminals. They were powerful, shadowy figures who had control over everything. They had planned for every outcome, every twist, every turn. And the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. As she drove off, the city lights flickering by, the full weight of the situation finally began to sink in. The officers, the armed men, the teenager, everyone was part of this, whether they knew it or not. There were forces at play here, forces that no one could control. And as the night deepened, the woman knew she was no longer just following the case. She was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Her phone buzzed again, a new message flashing across the screen. "You're out of time." The words were simple, but the message was clear. Whoever was behind all of this wasn't going to wait much longer. And if she didn't act quickly, everything and everyone she cared about would be lost. The stakes were higher than ever. The pieces were falling into place, but the real game hadn't even begun yet. What she didn't know was that the final twist was just around the corner, and when it hit, it would change everything forever. The woman's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she sped through the night, her mind still whirling with the cryptic message she had just received. "You're out of time." Those words felt like a countdown, like the seconds were slipping away faster than she could process. The urgency, the fear, it was all building to something. Something she couldn't outrun. As she neared the outskirts of the city, her phone buzzed again. The same number. No name attached, just a string of chilling words. The truth lies beneath the surface. Beneath the surface? What did that mean? She had turned every stone, uncovered every lead. But this was different. She wasn't just searching for information anymore. She was caught in the gears of a machine that didn't care if she lived or died. It had been moving in the background for years, manipulating everything and everyone. And now, it was closing in on her. Her eyes darted to the rear-view mirror. Nothing. No cars behind her. She exhaled a shaky breath, but didn't let up on the accelerator. She had to get there. The address on the paper, the one they'd handed her earlier, was just ahead. A small, dilapidated warehouse. It looked abandoned, forgotten, just like everything else tied to this twisted web. She pulled into the lot and killed the engine, the echo of the silence outside deafening. Stepping out of the car, she felt a chill creep down her spine. It wasn't just the cold night air, it was something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain. As she walked toward the warehouse, her footsteps the only sound in the stillness, she saw a figure in the doorway. A shadow, waiting, watching. The teenager. He was standing there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his posture tense. He looked like he had been waiting for her for hours, though his face didn't show it. His eyes met hers, full of confusion, fear, but also something else, a determination that matched her own. You, she said, more a question than a statement. What are you doing here? I don't know, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't leave you out here alone. I thought maybe I could help. She gave him a sharp look, her mind still focused on the task ahead. This is bigger than both of us. You need to go home. Get out of here before. Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps cut through the tension. A car door slammed somewhere in the distance. More figures approached, the kind of people she had spent her whole life avoiding. Men in suits, their faces cold and unreadable. They had been waiting for this moment, just like her. Didn't think we'd let you get this far, did you? The voice came from the man at the front, a familiar face, the same man who had handed her the envelope earlier. He was now flanked by two others, their eyes locked on her with the intensity of hunters closing in on their prey. Her breath hitched as she backed away slowly. I'm done running, she said, her voice steely now. She had come too far, uncovered too much to back down now. This was it. She could feel it in her bones. This moment was where everything changed. Then you're not going to like what happens next, the man said, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Before she could react, a sudden movement to her left caught her attention. The teenager. Without a second thought, he lunged toward the man who had been speaking, grabbing him by the arm. His eyes were wide, filled with panic. Stop. You don't know what you're doing. The man's eyes narrowed. You think you're a hero, kid? The teenager's breath came out in ragged gasps. I don't know what's going on, but I'm not going to let you hurt her. In that instant, the woman saw it, the one thing she hadn't expected. The teenager wasn't just any kid. His clothes, his demeanor, he wasn't some random person caught up in this. He was part of it, part of the operation. And yet, it wasn't the kind of connection she thought. His fear wasn't of them, it was of her. He was afraid of what she had uncovered. You're one of them? She asked, her voice trembling as the realization hit. You've been watching me? You. No, he interrupted, his voice breaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just another. Before he could finish, one of the men in the suits pulled out a gun. The sharp sound of the metal being drawn was like a gunshot to the heart. Her world seemed to freeze as the man leveled it at the teenager, his finger inching toward the trigger. No, the woman screamed, her body moving on instinct, throwing herself in front of the teenager. She wasn't ready to die. Not yet. There was too much left to do. Too many unanswered questions. The man hesitated. His eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition. He knew her, just as she knew him. But it wasn't just because of the case. They had crossed paths long before everything had gone wrong. You were supposed to be out of this, the man said, lowering the gun slightly. You were supposed to stay out of this. I'm not leaving, she said, her voice strong despite the fear that coursed through her veins. Not until I get the answers. Until I know why you're doing this. Why you've been hiding the truth. The man let out a low laugh, a sound that seemed almost bitter. You think you can handle the truth? You have no idea what you're dealing with. The people behind this. He trailed off, his eyes darkening as if he realized just how much he had said. Then, in a flash, everything clicked. The pieces fell into place. The woman had been right all along. This wasn't just about her. It was bigger than anyone had imagined. The people she was up against weren't just criminals or corrupt officials. They were part of something far deeper, something she hadn't been prepared for. And then, the final twist. The teenager's face suddenly softened. His eyes changed, and his hand went to his pocket. You're right, he whispered. But you're not going to like what happens next. The woman's heart stopped as he pulled out a small device, one that she recognized all too well. A detonator. The countdown had begun, and this time, it wasn't just her life at stake. It was everyone's. And as the first faint sound of an explosion rumbled in the distance, she realized that everything she had thought she knew had been one big lie. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. The game was far from over. The blast echoed through the night, a deep rumble that shook the very air. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as the teenager's hand hovered over the detonator. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. The realization of what was about to happen settled like a heavy weight in her stomach. She had come so close to the truth, so close to uncovering everything. But now, it seemed like it was slipping through her fingers, vanishing into the darkness. But then, something changed. The teenager's expression softened as he looked at her, his fingers trembling on the detonator. His eyes met hers, filled with regret, and something else, something human. The man in the suit who had been pointing the gun at her shifted his stance, his eyes now flicking back and forth between the two of them. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. "I didn't want it to end like this," the teenager whispered, his voice barely audible over the thrum of adrenaline in the air. "I don't know who you are, but I know you're not like them. You're not part of this." The woman's mind raced. Was this the same teenager who had been following her, the one who seemed so out of place, so innocent? Was it possible that he, too, was a pawn in this game? Or was there something more to him? Some deeper connection she hadn't yet seen? The seconds felt like hours, and the woman made a choice. With a swift motion, she stepped toward the teenager, her voice steady but forceful. "Give it to me." His hand shook as he hesitated, clearly torn. The gunman was still watching closely, waiting for any sudden movement, ready to strike. But the woman had no time to waste. She had to make him understand. "I know you didn't choose this," she said, her tone softer now. "But you can still choose what happens next. Hand it over, and I'll make sure you get out of this. You don't have to be their tool anymore." The teenager's eyes flickered, his emotions warring within him. The weight of the moment was almost too much for him to bear. And then, with a shaky breath, he made a decision. He pulled his hand back from the detonator and placed it in the woman's outstretched hand. "Don't make me regret this," he said quietly, almost pleading. She nodded, clutching the device tightly. Her heart was still racing, but there was now a sense of clarity. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him too. She had to make sure this all ended before it was too late. Turning her attention to the men in suits, she stood tall. "You've lost," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "This ends now." The man who had been in charge of the operation, the one who had seemed untouchable moments before, stiffened. His face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This is bigger than you, bigger than him, and you'll never stop us." But the woman wasn't listening anymore. She had a plan, one that had been forming in the back of her mind ever since the moment she stepped into this twisted game. As the man continued to rant, she pressed a button on the detonator. The faint beeping sound that followed was enough to silence the room. "We're not going down without a fight," she said, her voice now commanding. The man's eyes widened, but before he could react, the ground beneath them trembled once again. The explosion was smaller this time, controlled, meant only to send a clear message. It was a warning shot, and the remaining men in suits knew it. The woman didn't give them another chance to regroup. She moved fast, taking control of the situation. Her mind was sharp, every instinct focused on one thing, stopping the chain of events from spiraling any further. She grabbed the teenager by the arm and pulled him away from the wreckage of their planned destruction. "Come on, we need to go." Her voice was calm, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. As they ran, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had come face to face with the true scope of the conspiracy, but she had made a choice to end it on her terms. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. They reached the car, and the woman slammed the door shut. Her hands were still shaking as she started the engine, but she didn't look back. There would be time for explanations later. There was still so much she didn't understand, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a shot at finding out. "Where are we going?" the teenager asked, his voice still uncertain, but no longer tinged with the fear he had carried before. "To the truth," she replied, her eyes focused on the road ahead. "Wherever that may lead us." As they drove away from the warehouse, the night began to calm. the distant sounds of chaos fading into silence. The road stretched out before them, dark and unknown. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, a stark reminder of everything they had just escaped. But the woman knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The conspiracy had only just begun to unravel, and there were still so many pieces to put together. But whatever it took, she would see it through to the end. She had come too far to back down now. And as the teenager sat silently beside her, staring out the window, she couldn't help but wonder if he had truly understood the gravity of what had just happened. The world he had been a part of, the people he had been forced to serve, it was all collapsing around him. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He was free. And maybe, just maybe, he would find his own path now, away from the shadows. The truth, she knew, was still out there. And, together, they would uncover it. The blast echoed through the night, a deep rumble that shook the very air. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as the teenager's hand hovered over the detonator. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. The realization of what was about to happen settled like a heavy weight in her stomach. She had come so close to the truth, so close to uncovering everything. But now, it seemed like it was slipping through her fingers, vanishing into the darkness. But then, something changed. The teenager's expression softened as he looked at her, his fingers trembling on the detonator. His eyes met hers, filled with regret, and something else, something human. The man in the suit who had been pointing the gun at her shifted his stance, his eyes now flicking back and forth between the two of them. The tension was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. "I didn't want it to end like this," the teenager whispered, his voice barely audible over the thrum of adrenaline in the air. "I don't know who you are, but I know you're not like them. You're not part of this." The woman's mind raced. Was this the same teenager who had been following her, the one who seemed so out of place, so innocent? Was it possible that he, too, was a pawn in this game? Or was there something more to him? Some deeper connection she hadn't yet seen? The seconds felt like hours, and the woman made a choice. With a swift motion, she stepped toward the teenager, her voice steady but forceful. "Give it to me." His hand shook as he hesitated, clearly torn. The gunman was still watching closely, waiting for any sudden movement, ready to strike. But the woman had no time to waste. She had to make him understand. "I know you didn't choose this," she said, her tone softer now. "But you can still choose what happens next. Hand it over, and I'll make sure you get out of this. You don't have to be their tool anymore." The teenager's eyes flickered, his emotions warring within him. The weight of the moment was almost too much for him to bear. And then, with a shaky breath, he made a decision. He pulled his hand back from the detonator and placed it in the woman's outstretched hand. "Don't make me regret this," he said quietly, almost pleading. She nodded, clutching the device tightly. Her heart was still racing, but there was now a sense of clarity. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for him too. She had to make sure this all ended before it was too late. Turning her attention to the men in suits, she stood tall. "You've lost," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "This ends now." The man who had been in charge of the operation, the one who had seemed untouchable moments before, stiffened. His face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This is bigger than you, bigger than him, and you'll never stop us." But the woman wasn't listening anymore. She had a plan, one that had been forming in the back of her mind ever since the moment she stepped into this twisted game. As the man continued to rant, she pressed a button on the detonator. The faint beeping sound that followed was enough to silence the room. "We're not going down without a fight," she said, her voice now commanding. The man's eyes widened, but before he could react, the ground beneath them trembled once again. The explosion was smaller this time, controlled, meant only to send a clear message. It was a warning shot, and the remaining men in suits knew it. The woman didn't give them another chance to regroup. She moved fast, taking control of the situation. Her mind was sharp, every instinct focused on one thing, stopping the chain of events from spiraling any further. She grabbed the teenager by the arm and pulled him away from the wreckage of their planned destruction. "Come on. We need to go." Her voice was calm, but there was a fire in her eyes now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. As they ran, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had come face to face with the true scope of the conspiracy, but she had made a choice to end it on her terms. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. They reached the car, and the woman slammed the door shut. Her hands were still shaking as she started the engine, but she didn't look back. There would be time for explanations later. There was still so much she didn't understand, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a shot at finding out. "Where are we going?" the teenager asked, his voice still uncertain, but no longer tinged with the fear he had carried before. "To the truth," she replied, her eyes focused on the road ahead. "Wherever that may lead us." As they drove away from the warehouse, the night began to calm, the distant sounds of chaos fading into silence. The road stretched out before them, dark and unknown. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, a stark reminder of everything they had just escaped. But the woman knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The conspiracy had only just begun to unravel, and there were still so many pieces to put together. But whatever it took, she would see it through to the end. She had come too far to back down now. And as the teenager sat silently beside her, staring out the window, she couldn't help but wonder if he had truly understood the gravity of what had just happened. The world he had been a part of, the people he had been forced to serve, it was all collapsing around him. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He was free. And maybe, just maybe, he would find his own path now, away from the shadows. The truth, she knew, was still out there. And, together, they would uncover it.